published in 2007 by Swanick and colleagues in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. They looked at neurocognitive performance in pre-season, a large group of college athletes, and then they followed injury prevalence throughout the season. And they showed a strong correlation between non-contact ACL injury and poor neurocognitive performance during the pre-season. So what they concluded is that poor neurocognitive function is associated with lapses in attention, incorrect decision-making or poor decision-making, as well as lapses in attention that may lead to poor coordination and maybe put the athlete at risk of non-contact injury. In addition to this, we know that in competition athletes are exposed to increasing amounts of physical, psychological and physiological stress, or as I've termed it, psychophysiological stress. And if this isn't managed properly and effectively, this can lead to illness or susceptibility to injury. As well, stress is commonly indexed or measured using our stress hormone cortisol, and previous researchers have identified that prolonged elevations in cortisol at rest is associated with overtraining syndrome in athletes. So considering all of this information, I wanted to explore an intervention that may, one, improve cognition, reduce stress, and finally, improve immune function so athletes aren't susceptible to illness. Now, during my search for an intervention, I'm a bit of a left field thinker, and I kept sort of looking into mental strategies, including things like all the different meditations available, as well as things like yoga. And I kept coming across mindfulness and mindfulness training. Kept hearing the word mindfulness, being mindful in different situations. And so I thought, well, who's doing this in sport? Is anyone using it? And sure enough, it's more common than we think. I'm not sure if anyone knows who the gentleman is in the top left picture. He's wearing a Seattle Seahawks jacket and hat, but he's a lead performance psychologist in America. His name's Michael Gervais, and he worked with the Seattle Seahawks during their 2014 Super Bowl win. And briefly after their win, he came out with their coach Pete Carroll saying that they implemented mindfulness training as a regular training protocol, which helped them achieve their Super Bowl win. And we obviously know the guy in the bottom left corner can play a bit of tennis. He's come out and said that he practices mindfulness meditation every day for 10 minutes when he gets up in the morning, and it helps him deal with his day and any stresses that may come to fruition. And in the top middle picture, we've got the LA Lakers, and the man in the middle standing there is the most decorated NBA coach of all time. It's Phil Jackson. He coached the Chicago Bulls through the Michael Jordan era, and also the LA Lakers through the Kobe Bryant era, and now he's believes in an executive role with the New York Knicks. And he's brought mindfulness training to all of these NBA programs. Obviously down the bottom, South Sydney Rabbitohs, I was completely unaware of until about 12 months ago that an article came out that they were using mindfulness training during their final season when they won the premiership a couple of years ago. And then a big candidate in Australia for mindfulness training in sport is Paul Roos. Was the coach of the Swans, I believe, and now he's with the Melbourne Demons. Now, although their performance probably doesn't reflect his efforts, he's certainly making headway down there in Melbourne. And then obviously two very sort of big figures in sport, Adam Scott. He's confessed that he practices mindfulness training throughout golfing rounds during tournaments. And then we have LeBron James down the bottom right-hand corner. And this is him actually practicing a quick mindfulness session or mindfulness meditation between quarters of an NBA game. So what is mindfulness? It stems from Buddhist philosophy, and it's a significant element in Buddhist meditations such as Vipassana and Zen meditations. It's focused primarily on the monitoring of present moment-to-moment awareness in a non-judgmental manner. And in more recent years, mindfulness has made its way from Eastern traditions into Western society through clinical group-based interventions. Commonly, you may have seen mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's an 8-week program. And then obviously mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Now, although a novel therapy, the health benefits are well established in terms of being associated with mindfulness training. Things such as reduced hypertension, decreased anxiety and depression and other mood disorders, improved outcomes with substance abuse sufferers, and even benefits for cancer sufferers. Now, according to this figure here I've grabbed from Tang and colleagues in 2012, they believe that mindfulness meditation leads to an increased state of self-regulation, and this is contributed to by three components. One, attention control, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. In addition to this, they believe that through practice, we'll go through different stages of mindfulness. So for naive meditators, it's a state of effortful doing, through into a middle stage of an effort to reduce mind wandering, and then when dealing with people who've practiced meditation for a long time, it's a case of being in a state of effortless being. So to describe that, most people that practice mindfulness can easily achieve a state of mindfulness and present moment awareness, whereas it might be sort of a little bit difficult, or more difficult for those who are just coming into practice. So what we're going to do now, because I'm sure that there's probably people in the room, has anyone completed mindfulness training before or mindfulness meditation? Dabbled in it? All right, we're going to have a little dabble now. Okay, so I just want everyone to just sit up nice and tall. That's it. Hands rested gently in your lap. All right, now I'm going to start this this little meditation, and I'm going to pass it over to an instruction I have on my phone using an application. All right, so everyone gently closing their eyes. All right, and taking a deep breath in. Feel your belly rise into your chest, and then gently breathing out. Nice and slow. Release that air out, either through your mouth or your nose. And breathing in again. Feel the air come into your lungs. Chest elevates, and slowly out. I want you to keep this breathing cycle going. As you breathe, I want you to concentrate on the air coming in through your nose or your mouth as it enters your lungs. Feel your tummy expand. And then feel that air escape through your lungs, through your upper airways, and out through your mouth and nose. I want you to focus on each breath as it comes in and out. Thinking about any other sounds that might be happening in the room. Any sensations through your body, like the pressure of your feet on the floor, or your backside against the chair. Any sensations or feelings you might be having in your lower back sitting here. Just accept that they're there and put them aside, and bring your attention back to the breath. Keep going with this breathing. I'm now going to pass this over to the instruction of what's called an exercise of a body scan.
Smiling Mind Bite-Sized Meditation 1-minute body scan. Along with your breath, your body is a great object for your meditation because it's always there. Settle into your position and allow your attention to move to your toes. Wiggle them slightly. Then move your attention from your feet to your ankles, up to your calves, knees, and thighs. Now move your attention to your hands. Focus on your fingers, the palm of your hands, your wrists, arms, and shoulders. Notice if you're holding any tension anywhere. Move your attention to your stomach and chest. Feel them expand and contract with your natural breath. shift your attention up to your neck, your jaw, tongue, nose, and eyes. Relax your entire face. Then allow your attention to expand to feel your whole body calm and relaxed.
All right, everyone, finally take one deep breath in. And as you breathe out, open your eyes and come back to the room. Everyone looks pretty relaxed. All right, so that gives you a bit of an insight into some of the an exercise that is available and when looking into different areas of mindfulness training. It's called the body scan. Now, considering these three components contributing to self-regulation, previous studies have highlighted that, or have demonstrated changes in brain morphology and activation that have been associated with either the practice of or completing mindfulness training interventions. So over on the top right-hand corner, we have a picture of the brain, and the highlighted section is the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, this area of the brain is primarily associated with attention regulation and attention control. So to give you an idea as to real-world function, it might be trying to focus your attention on a particular task for a long period of time, or maybe switching your attention between two or more focal points. Now, research has demonstrated that there is increased activation in this area in experienced meditators as compared to non-meditators during a meditation session. In addition, Grant and colleagues has demonstrated that mindfulness training is associated with increased cortical thickness and white matter integrity in the anterior cingulate cortex. Mindfulness training is also shown to affect emotion regulation with greater activation of prefrontal control mechanisms. So, for example, the dorsal medial and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So I've just given a bit of a diagram across here. And what this then does is it augments an inhibitory control of the amygdala. And for those that don't know, the amygdala is primarily responsible for psychological reactivity, things like fear appraisal and survival mechanisms. So the belief that the benefits there is that this greater activation in prefrontal control mechanisms can then control your psychological reactivity, or have more of a control on that area. In addition, down the bottom we have a picture of the default mode network. This consists of the posterior cingulate cortex, the inferior parietal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. I believe the parietal lobule. Now, the default mode network, its primary function is it's active at rest and also during mind wandering. So to give you an idea as to a real-world situation, you might be, whether it's some of the PhD, honours and master's students here, you might be sitting at your desk and you're trying to write your lit review, or you're trying to get a paper finished for publication, or maybe some of the Centre of Excellence staff, you might be answering numerous emails that we send to you all the time, or maybe some of the sports science staff, you might be sort of dealing with athletes, and you find yourself thinking about other things. What am I going to cook for dinner tonight? Oh, that's washing at home I've got to do when I get home. This is greater activation of that default mode network. Now, research has shown that with mindfulness training, this causes a decreased activation of the default mode network, and also Brewer has demonstrated a stronger coupling between areas of this network and this anterior cingulate cortex, and they believe that this has led to increased cognitive control of functions like mind wandering. Now, as I was saying, all of these components are said to work synergistically to establish a process of enhanced self-regulation. All right, now, it is well established that mindfulness training improves or is beneficial towards cognitive function in healthy and clinical populations. It's been well established that it has a positive effect on cognitive function in vigilance, selective and executive attention, working memory and executive function. I'll just touch briefly on a couple of these papers. So the figure on the top right-hand corner I've taken from a study from 2007 by Tang and colleagues, and they investigated the effect of a 5-day, 20-minute per day mindfulness training intervention on performance of an attentional network task. And you can see that this figure has compared the experimental or the mindful group versus the control group at post trials, and they've showed that there was no change between, or no difference between alerting and orienting. However, there was an increased or improved performance in the mindful group in the conflict monitoring task. So this indicates benefits in terms of executive attention. The table down the bottom, this was taken from Heron and colleagues in 2009. Now, the top variables here, they've been taken from an autobiographical memory specificity task, and down the bottom, this has been taken from a cognitive inhibition task. And you can see that this shows from pre-trial measures to post-intervention measures, and in the mindfulness group, there was a significant improvement in specificity in the autobiographical memory specificity test. In addition, there was a very much decreased total error score in the cognitive inhibition task, whereas in the control group, there was no change. With regards to the effects on stress, I'd like to just focus on stress as indexed by cortisol, our stress hormone. And in clinical studies, they've all looked at the effect of the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program. So Carlson implemented this with breast and prostate cancer patients and showed a decreased diurnal salivary cortisol concentration following the intervention. In addition, Wittek, Janusek and colleagues did the same with breast cancer patients and examined plasma cortisol, which is demonstrated in this figure on the top right-hand corner. You can see that it was measured at 4 time points. Time 1 was before the intervention, time 2 directly afterward, time 3 and time 4 a month and 2 months afterwards respectively. And you can see that in the mindful group, there was a significant decrease in plasma cortisol concentration from before compared to after measures, whereas in the control group, there was actually a significant increase in plasma cortisol, or the stress response, from before to after measures. In addition, Marcus in 2003 examined the effect of this mindfulness-based stress reduction program on substance abuse sufferers and their salivary cortisol response over a day. And you can see from this figure, they measured salivary cortisol at 4 time points throughout the day. The black line represents their cortisol secretion before the intervention, and the grey line afterwards, and they showed a significant decrease in their peak salivary cortisol concentration. With regards to its effects on immune function, previous studies have looked at various different markers of immune function. So firstly, Robinson in 2003 implemented the mindfulness-based stress reduction program in HIV sufferers and showed an increase in their natural killer cell activity and production, or number. Now, for those that don't know, your natural killer cells, they're a type of white blood cell that has a primary responsibility of immune function. The same was done by Wittek and Janusek in 2008. They showed an increase in natural killer cell activity, but they also showed a decrease in cytokine production or inflammatory markers in breast cancer patients. Now, this is very important because previous research has shown that there's a direct correlation between increased cytokine production and progression of breast cancer tumours. Remarkably, in 2009, Creswell published a study that showed that HIV patients who completed a mindfulness-based stress reduction program had increased CD4 plus lymphocyte production. So this is a major immune function white blood cell. However, in the control group, there was actually a further reduction in their CD4 plus lymphocyte production. So this indicates, and they concluded, that mindfulness training could potentially be associated with a reversing effect of the auto dysregulation of immune function that's associated with HIV. And finally, Fan and colleagues in 2010 implemented a 4-week mindfulness training intervention with a group of university students and compared it to a 4-week relaxation program with another group of university students. And they showed that there was actually no change in mucosal immune function, which is immunoglobulin A concentration, in the relaxation group, whereas there was an increase in immune function or IgA concentration in the group that completed the mindfulness study. Now this brings us to mindfulness training research that's been completed in sport. Sports psychologists believe that mindfulness has an overlap with the concept of flow. They believe that both share this present moment experience as well. They're both focused on things like calmness, serenity, and mind-body unity. So they believe that if athletes can achieve flow through mindfulness, they believe that this will contribute to sports performance. And there's been a bit of an on-flow effect with the research that's been created. So the studies or the programs that I've put in white, these are all studies that have been published in sports psychology. And you can see that, for example, the 9-week mindfulness acceptance commitment approach was created by Gardner and Moore, and it was implemented with college athletes and an elite springboard diver. And they showed increased ratings of subjective coaches' ratings of performance, increased subjective ratings of perfectionism, mindfulness, optimism, and I believe self-awareness. In 2009, Corfam created the 4-week mindfulness sport performance enhancement program. It was implemented in golfers and archers and also long distance runners. And yet again, they showed improvements in other subjective ratings that may contribute to performance. Boltzl in 2014 created a 6-week program implemented in soccer players, and they showed increased subjective ratings of such things as accepting their performance on the field, as well as increased team cohesion. And then finally, the most recent, by Scott Hamilton and colleagues in 2016, found increased mindfulness as well as decreased competitive state anxiety in competitive cyclists. There's no doubt that this research is preliminary evidence that mindfulness training can contribute to enhanced sport performance. However, it must be noted that all of these studies have been based around subjective ratings that may contribute to performance, and therefore it really opens up the idea that there's a lot of paucity, there's paucity in the research surrounding how mindfulness may objectively affect factors that contribute to performance. So I've highlighted in gold here a study by John in 2011 who implemented a 4-week intervention, and they investigated its effects on shooting performance as well as pre-competition measures of salivary cortisol, so pre-competition stress, and this was measured half hour before competition. You can see from the table over here on the right, salivary cortisol was measured at 0 day, so that represents just prior to the first competition day. On the 29th day, so that's after 4 weeks of mindfulness training. And then they took another measure 7 days later. As well, down the bottom we've got PS 0 day, so that's shooting performance on the first day, and then 4 weeks later on the second day. You can see that in the mindfulness group there was a significant reduction in their pre-competition salivary cortisol concentration from the first competition to the second competition following that 4-week training period. And also that shooting performance actually significantly increased from the first competition to second competition. Whereas in the control group, there was actually an increase in salivary cortisol concentration, and there was no change in their shooting performance. So this is, to my knowledge, this is the first study that has investigated the effects of mindfulness training on an actual physiological marker. Okay, and they've demonstrated that mindfulness training is associated with an attenuation in the pre-competition related increase in stress. So I felt that the natural order of further research and my research would be to investigate whether mindfulness training can attenuate a chronic increase in resting cortisol concentration during a period where athletes are submitted to heavy competition. This brings about the major experiment of my thesis. titled Mindfulness Training Attenuates the Increase in Salivary Cortisol Concentration Associated with Competition in Highly Trained Wheelchair Basketball Players. And this was just recently accepted with the Journal of Sports Sciences. So the aim of this study was to determine the effect of 8 weeks of mindfulness training on salivary cortisol, so physiological stress, and rate of immunoglobulin A secretion, so mucosal immune function, in wheelchair basketballers while they completed a 7-week competition period. So all participants in this study were members of the QAS wheelchair basketball squad and were randomised into 2 groups, obviously the mindful group and the control group. Might I add that none of these participants had prior experience in any form of meditation. The mindful group were required to complete the 8-week meditation or mindfulness meditation program, as well as training and competition, whereas the control group just training and competition as per usual. You can see from this schematic down the bottom, the mindfulness training intervention commenced 3 days prior to the commencement of the competition period and ended 3 days after the completion of the competition period. All right, and so all participants attended a familiarisation session. Testing sessions occurred at baseline, so that's the start of the intervention, at 2-week intervals, so 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, at the end of the intervention, and also 2 weeks following. So the mindfulness training intervention was delivered to participants via the application known as Smiling Mind, which I just used with everyone in the room before. And the order of exercises and meditation and the whole program itself was predetermined by myself. During the first 2 weeks of the intervention, this was considered a bit of an introduction to mindfulness, whereby athletes completed 5 of the adult programs from the Smiling Mind application during the first week, and then did it again in the second week. And each program contained an 8-minute meditation or guided instructed meditation, as well as roughly 10 minutes of mindfulness exercises. All right, so this accumulated to roughly 20 minutes of mindfulness training 5 times a week. During the next 6 weeks, this was more intensive. Athletes were required to complete a 45-minute meditation session, in addition to about 5 minutes of mindfulness exercises taken from the bite-sized program on the Smiling Mind application 5 times a week. All right, might I add that the 8-minute meditation contained a lot more instruction and a lot less silence, giving more guidance to the athletes during that first 2 weeks, whereas the 45-minute meditation contained longer periods of silence, which basically made the athletes utilise their skills from the first 2 weeks to achieve and maintain a state of mindfulness during those longer meditations. Also, to ensure compliance, the application logs and records all meditations and exercises that have been completed, and this was reviewed by myself during each testing session. So during each testing session, we collected whole unstimulated saliva in the morning at the same time of day. We controlled for caffeine, alcohol, teeth brushing, and also made sure that all athletes completed or consumed the same diet 12 hours prior to testing. So saliva was collected using the iPro oral fluid collector. Up here this gentleman's placing it on the tip of his tongue. He'll close his mouth, and once 0.5 ml has been collected, you can see that black tip in the tubing there will actually turn bright blue. This is then placed in a buffer solution, one of those little bottles at the bottom there, and then it's analysed on a lateral flow device, those little strips there, and then and also further analysed in the LFD reader. So this analysis system is quite new and novel. It's very time efficient and proves to be effective for further research and also used by sports scientists and coaches. So I'm going to discuss a reliability experiment I completed later in this presentation. In addition to this, the time of collection was recorded for calculation of flow rate to then determine rate of IgA secretion as a measure of time. So this brings us to the results of the study. So this figure shows the mean group rate of IgA secretion across all of the time points throughout the intervention. And you see what I've done is I've put in a shaded section on the graph which indicates the competition period, and you can see that it starts 3 days after the commencement of the mindfulness training intervention and finishes 3 days before the completion of the mindfulness training intervention. There was a significant effect of time whereby rate of IgA secretion or mucosal immune function increased from baseline to 2 weeks, remained significantly elevated from 4 weeks with respect to baseline at 4 weeks and 6 weeks, and returned following completion of the competition period to a level no different to baseline at the end of the training intervention, and then remained roughly at the same level at 2 weeks following. Might I add that there was actually no group difference between at any of the time points when measuring rate of IgA secretion. Let's have a look at cortisol now. So there was a significant time and group interaction here. Firstly, looking at the control group, so obviously the squares. From baseline to 2 weeks, there was a significant increase in cortisol, so a significant increase in their stress response. And this remained significantly elevated at 4 weeks and 6 weeks, and it decreased, their stress response decreased to a level no different to baseline following completion of the competition period and the end of the mindfulness training intervention. Whereas this wasn't the case in the mindfulness group. I'm going to throw in a few things. So the physiological stress or cortisol increased and did significantly increase from baseline to 2 weeks. So this was the introductory period of the mindfulness training intervention. It then decreased to a level no different to baseline at 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and 8 weeks. All right, so from 2 weeks to 8 weeks was the mindfulness intensive period of that training intervention. So we concluded the competition period was associated with the increase in mucosal immune function or rate of IgA secretion, and because there was no group difference at any of the time points, we concluded that mindfulness training had no effect on mucosal immune function in the wheelchair basketball players. Competition period was associated with an increase in salivary cortisol in the control group, and we did expect to see this with the implementation of that competition period. However, mindfulness training attenuated that increase in the mindful group. Now, just going to postulate a few things here, but we believe that the mindfulness training gave the mindful group potential neurological benefits that then allowed them to react in a way that they could attenuate their stress response. So we believe that mindfulness training may be a useful recovery tool for managing the onset of stress during competition. Now, while I was completing this study, as I said, I was using the iPro system to analyse salivary cortisol and rate of IgA secretion. There was a couple of students at Bond University that were saying they were establishing the reliability of this tool as it's only new in sporting research. However, upon reading their manuscripts, concurrent reliability, so with a retest interval of about sort of 20 minutes, had only been established for IgA secretion. As well, the inter-day reliability for salivary cortisol was questionable. All right, so because I was using this system to analyse cortisol and IgA, I really needed inter-day reliability to then make these conclusions. That's what I did. So the next study I'm presenting is the reliability of salivary cortisol and immunoglobulin A measurements from the iPro before and after a sprint cycling exercise. And this was accepted and is in press with the Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness. So I had two aims of this study: to assess the inter-day reliability of the iPro to determine resting salivary cortisol concentration and rate of IgA secretion, but also determine that it is sensitive in detecting a change that may be elicited by a stimulus. And previous research has demonstrated that cortisol or physiological stress will increase and rate of IgA secretion will decrease in response to sprint cycling. So I implemented a sprint cycling protocol. I recruited 14 active healthy males for this study, and we had to ensure that they had similar weekly routines in terms of work, study and social commitments. The reason being, I was trying to reproduce their stress response in their saliva as well as their immune function response 7 days apart. Okay, so we controlled for diet, sleep quality and perceived stress. Firstly, focusing on the top figure, this is a schematic of the experimental design. Participants attended a familiarisation session whereby they were introduced to the exercise protocol and general procedures of the study. 7 days later, they completed 2 testing sessions separated by 7 days, whereby they came in and completed a 24-hour diet diary, and they were required to consume the same diet 7 days later. Also completed a perceived stress scale and sleep quality. Saliva sample was taken, as well as resting heart rate and resting blood lactate, and 5 minutes later they completed the exercise protocol. Directly afterwards, a blood lactate was taken, as well 15 minutes later another salivary sample. And you can see down the bottom, this is the exercise protocol that they completed. So it was roughly a 4.5 minute warm-up of cycling, followed by 5 minutes rest, and then 2 30-second max efforts on the watt bike, separated by 3.5 minutes active and passive recovery, and then followed by 3 minutes active recovery. So these are the results of the study. A lot of figures there. The first table, we've got the mean performance and physiological variables taken from the 2 trials. Now, from Wingate Anaerobic Test 1 downwards, you can see the performance measures. And if you're looking at any of the figures comparing trial 1 to trial 2, there was no significant difference between performance measures. In addition, looking at the physiological variables, as you can see that there was no difference between resting salivary cortisol between trial 1 and trial 2, as well no difference between resting rate of IgA secretion. In addition, the response was very similar. In cortisol, it increased, and there was actually no difference between post-exercise measures. And this was also the same with post-exercise measures of rate of IgA secretion. Now, looking at the reliability table, so I've got ICC, this represents intra-class correlation coefficient. So an intra-class correlation coefficient basically means that how well does the rank within a certain sample. It's then replicated again in consecutive trials. All right, so according to Hopkins, a value of above 0.7 is considered acceptable reliability, above 0.8 is good, above 0.9 is excellent. So purely focusing on the physiological ICCs, you can see that the lowest was 0.96, so that indicates excellent reliability. In addition, when looking at CV, so this stands for coefficient of variation. This is considered probably the most important reliability measure, and this indicates how much variation that, say, a sports scientist or a coach can expect to see as a typical error between 2 trials, and it's a percentage. And Hopkins states that below 10% is acceptable reliability, and that's just for performance tests. Considering these are physiological markers, both resting salivary cortisol and resting rate of IgA secretion were both below 10%. In addition, the post-exercise values were just above that 10% mark. Nonetheless, the response in terms that salivary cortisol increased in response to sprint cycling and rate of IgA secretion decreased matches previous research. So we concluded that the iPro is a reliable method for determining salivary cortisol and rate of IgA secretion at a 7-day retest period. Now, while I completed those 2 studies with the Centre of Excellence program, before joining the QAS here, I did some research with the Queensland Reds Rugby Union program, and I implemented a 4-week training study with the Queensland Reds just to assess whether mindfulness training could then alter cognitive performance. However, before I did that, I had to establish the reliability of a cognitive test in a sporting population. So this experiment was titled Indices of Cognitive Function Measured in Rugby Union Players Using a Computer-Based Test Battery, and was published in the Journal of Sports Sciences in January 2016. We recruited 18 male rugby union players, and they completed repeated performance of a cognitive test known as CogState, containing 4 tests. A test of executive function, which is the Groton-Mays learning test, of psychomotor function, the detection test, or some of you may have heard of the psychomotor vigilance task, of vigilance via the identification test, and also visual learning and memory using the one-card learning task. Players completed repeated trials at a 30-minute and 24-hour interval, and you can see that I've put in the reliability calculations here, purely focusing on the mean intra-class correlation coefficient and the mean coefficient of variation. You can see that for performance variables of the detection, identification and one-card learning task, all ICCs were above the 0.7 mark, indicating reliability. As well, the coefficient of variation were all below 10%. However, the Groton-Mays learning task, assessing executive function, had a questionable intra-class correlation coefficient and quite a large coefficient of variation, around 20%. So its reliability was deemed questionable and was excluded from further research. This brings about my training study I completed with the Reds. So it's called The Effects of Mindfulness Meditation Training on Cognitive Performance in Rugby Union Players. Recruited 16 male rugby union players from the Queensland Reds under-20 squad, and they were randomised into 2 groups, obviously a mindful group and a control group, where the mindful group completed a 4-week intervention. This comprised 3 20-minute meditation sessions each week for 4 weeks, in addition to training, whereas the control group completed training as per usual. What I wanted to do in this study is not only observe the chronic effect of mindfulness training that may have potentially happened on cognitive performance, but also potentially the acute effect, but also on top of that, whether training might have a chronic effect on the acute response to mindfulness training. So during each testing session, participants completed repeated cognitive trials of the CogState battery, and this was separated by either 20 minutes mindfulness meditation or 20 minutes quiet rest for the control group. So the results of this study, there are actually no acute or chronic changes in cognitive performance. And because of that, we concluded that the 4-week intervention that was implemented did not evoke any changes in cognitive performance in the rugby union players. Reasons for this? We believe primarily it was because of dosage, that 4 weeks, 3 20-minute meditation sessions per week would not evoke changes in cognition in team sport athletes. Nonetheless, it must be considered that after looking at several previous research papers in clinical and healthy populations, interventions of varied length, including ones that were much shorter and less frequent than the one in the present study, showed positive influence on cognitive performance. So therefore, it may have been the CogState battery that it was not sensitive to detect changes that may have been elicited by the mindfulness training. And some might argue that implementing a sport-specific, say, decision-making task may have picked up changes. However, when dealing with those tests, their reliability or repeatability is questionable without potential habituation. And then finally, it may have been the participant group itself, such things as sample size and potentially internal motivations from each player. So the practical applications of my research, obviously with the 2 different tests, the CogState battery is a reliable measure of cognitive performance, and sports scientists and coaches can now implement this battery in whole or in part to assess cognitive performance and be sure that if there's any changes, that it's due to an external factor, whether it's fatigue, sleep deprivation, a stimulus, exercise, and not due to experimental noise. In addition, the iPro point-of-care salivary analysis system. We've demonstrated that it is reliable in determining resting salivary cortisol and rate of IgA secretion. And more importantly, it's sensitive to changes elicited by a stimulus. And in our case, it was maximal cycling, but future research might look at, say, chronic changes, much like I did with the mindfulness training intervention. And finally, with mindfulness training, although the 4-week training intervention didn't evoke any changes in cognitive performance, this is important for sports scientists and coaches who are looking to implement mindfulness training doses or looking at certain doses that they want to implement with their athletes, and knowing that shorter doses may not be effective. Nonetheless, with larger doses, much like the 8-week program I implemented with the wheelchair basketball players, I believe that it provides athletes with a self-regulatory process in that they were able to objectively reappraise stresses or challenges they experienced during that competition period, and then interrupt their psychological reactivity to those challenges, and thereby decreasing their concomitant stress response. So therefore, I believe that mindfulness training is an effective strategy for managing stress during competition. In terms of my own recommendations, when I first started my thesis, I met with a psychologist who's also a Buddhist monk, and I was saying to him about, look, I want to implement mindfulness training in team sport athletes and other athletes, and I said, look, could you give me an idea as to what sort of intervention I should put together? And he said, well, Luke, it doesn't matter if they do 1 minute or an hour meditation, it's all good. There's no such thing as bad mindfulness practice. And I think that needs to be remembered if it's going to be implemented with athletes. It all depends on obviously how much time they have, as well as obviously how interested they are and sort of at what stage they're at with wanting to complete mindfulness. I believe that it should be implemented as a standard training procedure for the purpose of recovery and stress management based on my research. Although we did a 5 times a week, a quite intensive program with the wheelchair basketballers, something along the lines of a minimum 3 to 4 meditations per week, coupled with either an individual or a group exercise each week for team cohesion. And obviously start short. If you were to just introduce 45-minute meditations with athletes straight away, you might notice that they might have issues with staying awake. Or even just a lot of mind wandering. It's something that's got to be gradually built with emphasis on mindfulness training, all right? Much like physical strength and anaerobic training, aerobic training. And also it's regular practice, so it's not a quick fix, and that it might not work for everyone. Obviously different psychological strategies work for different people. And based on some advice I was given, and also ideas I was given by the wheelchair basketballers, that mindfulness, it's great in sport but also in everyday life. It helped them a lot with dealing with different stresses they had outside of their sport, and I think that this opens a realm for a lot of future research. And just to finish, just a few acknowledgements. I'd obviously like to acknowledge Griffith University for supporting my PhD, and my supervisor, Dr. Claire Minahan, who couldn't be here today. Without her, I wouldn't be here. As well, I can't stress enough how grateful I am for the full support of the Queensland Academy of Sport and the Centre of Excellence program. Jeff, Christine and Alan, your sort of constant positivity towards my research and making it a reality for me is it's pretty amazing. And then finally, of all the athletes, Bridie Keane, who's not here today, she was a participant in the experiment, and the whole wheelchair basketball squad, as well as Tom Kyle, their coach. When I first came to implement this large training intervention, I thought it would only be a case study experiment. However, Bridie, she said she wanted to participate, and she said, you should talk to Tom. He's our coach. He's pretty interested in this sort of thing. And before I knew it, I had 16 participants. So they made this all a reality. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
When For study 2, I think, with the cycling one, you mentioned that you somehow controlled sleep. I was interested in how you did that.
Purely through a 24-hour sleep quality score.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough that I actually had no participants who turned up indicating poor sleep quality.
Yep.
If they had have, they would have completed testing on a subsequent day.
Yep.
Yeah.
Question with the wheelchair basketball study you did.
Yes.
Did you look at the actual performance parameters from those controlled versus non-controlled groups? Like, did the mindfulness group and getting at play better in that competition than the non-mindfulness group? Were there no significant effects? I guess it's a great question, because during the study, some of the mindful group was saying to me, "Look, I played on the weekend and I feel like I had a greater free throw percentage," and so I scoured through all of the collected performance data there is available, and it's just so hard to quantify. And it would have been wonderful to implement a performance test, whether that's a free throw or something along those lines. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to collect that data. Actually, at the moment, Bridie and myself are working on a qualitative study, because at the end of the 8 weeks, I had all athletes complete almost a reflective questionnaire, and a lot of the participants were saying that they had improvements in their game performance. So we're just looking into that now. Alan?
It's sort of very different results with the wheelchair basketballers than the rugby players. And there were two, it was both a longer total duration and a longer time per session.
Sure.
If you put it down to that, or do you think there are other factors that
Yeah. I think that there potentially could have been other factors. One of the biggest things that I noticed, especially from my transition with the Queensland Reds to the QAS, was just the support of the research. I think with mindfulness, it's got to be something that's 100% backed by everyone within the squad. Initially, there was a lot of barriers within the Queensland Reds, and I think that if there isn't that self-belief from your coaches initially, then this could potentially have an on-flow effect with the participants. Not saying that was the case, but certainly could have been. Yeah.
I was just thinking, following from that, could it have been maybe that the wheelchair basketballers were in a more high or a stressful situation, so then you see the greater sort of effect of the mindfulness training versus a non-stressful situation, possibly? 100%.
That could have very well been the case, and the choice of looking at, there's potential. Even though I compared the sort of performance measures from the cognitive tests to previous studies, it was really there was no difference between, say, reaction time in the detection task in the rugby union players as compared to, say, a group of volleyball players or another group of AFL players. So maybe it was the case that mindfulness training wasn't able to improve those cognitive performance measures because they were already at a level that were quite good. That makes sense. Yeah. And that's before I put together the wheelchair basketball study. I remember it was a very good tip I had from a medical science lecturer at Griffith, and he said to me, because I said I was going to look at some physiological markers, and he said, "Oh, you're going to look at cortisol?" I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Well, make sure you get them when they're not at rest, because you can't decrease something that's already at rest." I was like, okay, how am I going to do that? But it just all happened to pan out. So yeah, coincidentally perfect for the study.
Just a follow-up question on that same point. In your literature review bit at the start, you didn't, I didn't notice anyone presented mindfulness training to be negative at all, or it was all seen to be positive for mindfulness training.
Sure.
Has anyone, except for yourself, maybe with that rugby task, found a null
the hypothesis, has anyone found that nothing changed, or that the mindfulness group got worse compared to a yoga control, or
Sure.
has there been any adverse literature, I guess?
Yes, I'm going to refresh my memory. Stress. Okay, so the study by, it was Robinson, also looked at cortisol, and they found no change. They also concluded that, I believe that due to the physiological effects of HIV, that it has a major impact on your stress response already, and so that it may have masked any changes that may have been elicited by mindfulness. And that's sort of, in terms of in stress, that's sort of the only study that found no changes. And I'm sure that there's probably more, but they failed to make it out into journals because they don't find effects, much like my training study. Yeah.
Can I ask you a practical question? You know, when you're using the Smiling Minds, you know, and that app's got quite a number of different, like it says, you know, there's ones for kids and for adults and for athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, are they all pretty much the same? And I know you say any mindfulness training is good, but is the sport athlete one actually really relevant from your
well,
space?
the Smiling Mind app has actually been undergone a lot of changes since I used it with the wheelchair basketball squad. And when I used it, they had a sporting one and a general one.
Yeah.
The sporting one was, because it had a lot of funding from Cricket Australia, it's, as much as they don't say that it is, it's very much based around cricket, walking out onto the ground and sort of making statements like that. In addition, I felt that the general program was more suitable for the wheelchair basketballers. It was just more general, especially because they were starting from a sort of a viewpoint of no previous experience. I think that that's something that probably needs to be emphasised, and then moving into more sport-specific activities.
The app in Mindfulness, what was the...
Smiling Mind.
Smiling Mind. Is that something you can download and then use offline, like while you're on an airplane?
Yes, you have to download the programs first. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I emphasised with all of the participants, because we all know how much we use our smartphones these days and how often we get messages and updates and that sort of thing, that when using the application, to put their phone on airplane mode.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks. We just thank Luke for your time. Some really interesting thoughts.